So today I want to talk about something that resonates with anyone who's been in a toxic relationship, both men and women. So listen closely. Strength. Strength doesn't save you. It only makes the fall harder. Let's talk about Samson, the biblical Samson. This was a man stronger than armies, but he was weaker than love. And I believe that today, men are still bleeding from that same ancient wound. So let me give you guys some historical context to set the stage for the story. Samson's world wasn't myth. It was a real place. And this place, just like today, is soaked in blood. And it's caught between tribes and tyrants and constant warfare. So it's no fairy tale. There was no clean borders. This was a place where chaos reigned. Now, this was during the early Iron Age in what we call today modern day Palestine. And the time was somewhere between 1100 and 1000 BC. And during this time, Israel had no kings. So this is before the times of King David. There was no King Solomon. There was no Saul. It was basically a loose confederation of tribes scattered across the highlands, and these guys are barely hanging on. And they lived in the shadow of much greater powers. And often these powers were disorganized and vulnerable, and they were fragmented. This was the era of the judges and the Bible. These were the biblical book of Judges. And they were these tribal warlords and prophets and these warriors who only rose up in moments of crisis. And Samson, he was one of these, but he didn't rule, he raged. Now, on the flip side of this coin, on the other side of the line, if you will, were the Philistines. Now, the Philistines, they weren't just these cartoon villains or these, cookie cutter bad guys you see in these biblical movies they play in Hallmark or something like that. They were a sophisticated enemy. They were a sea people and with origins possibly tied to Aegean roots. So think of the Aegean Sea in the Greek islands. Think of places like Cyprus or islands across Greece and Turkey. And what they brought with them was superior metallurgy. So early mastery of iron weapons. So imagine having at least the predecessors to iron weapons during the Bronze Age. And they also had organized city-states, places that still exist today, places like Gaza, or ancient places like Ashkelon and Ashdod and Gath and Ekron. And they had standing armies, and they had trade routes, they had temples, and they also had what do you call a burgoyes class or an elite ruling class. So the Philistines were at the cutting edge of the Iron Age power, if you will, and they knew it. So to the Israelites, these guys were invaders and occupiers and oppressors. But to themselves, they were a civilized force or a civilized people trying to tame these wild hill tribes. So to put it simply, Samson was to them basically some backwoods barbarian with divine backing. He was Rambo. He was an army of one, fighting against this high-tech empire. Now, again, this was not a time of peace. This was the Mad Max era of ancient Israel. And this was the law of the jungle. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And the judges, they weren't kings. Again, they were warlords, avengers, instrument of divine justice, for better or for worse. And Samson, he wasn't elegant like a Greek hero, and he wasn't righteous like Moses. Again, this guy, he was wild and he was driven and he was chosen, but again, he was unrefined. Now, before we meet Samson the warrior, you have to understand what he was born into. So Samson, he was a Nazirite. So a Nazirite, so you guys can understand, was not a priest and it was not a prophet, but something rare, maybe something in between. And a Nazirite was someone set apart, someone who chose or was chosen to walk a different spiritual path. And the Nazirites would take sacred vows. I could think of 3 specifically off the top of my head right now. One was no wine or strong drinks. So they were forbidden to drink alcohol. They had to reject indulgence. This was a sort of purification for the soul. Another one was no razor on the head. So let the hair grow as a symbol of divine power. This is a way to sort of kill your ego, if you will, your vanity. The third one was no contact with the dead, which was to avoid spiritual defilement. So they had weird rules, like they couldn't attend funerals or they couldn't die a certain way. And to be honest, these weren't just rules. They were a ritual rejection of everything ordinary. The Nazirites lived outside of comfort, vanity, and impurity. And they were devoted entirely to God's purpose. Or at the time, it was Yahweh. And Samson, he wasn't just a Nazirite by choice. He was destined to be a Nazirite from the womb. Chosen before birth to be God's living weapon, if you will. Now, before Samson was born, again, he was chosen. And according to the biblical text and to the legends, his mother was barren, so she couldn't have offspring until an angel appeared and told her son would be a Nazirite. And then he instilled the 3 sacred vows or rules, if you will. No wine, no razors, and again, no corpses, meaning no unclean death. And this vow wasn't just about rules. Again, it symbolized a radical separation from earthly desires. So Samson, again, wasn't just a man. He was supposed to be a living weapon of God. So to me, this was sort of a precursor, or basically the rise of a demigod, because Samson's strength was also legendary. So there's biblical accounts that he tore a lion apart with his bare hands. There's accounts where he slaughtered 1,000 Philistines using only a donkey's jawbone. So he didn't do it with a sword, not with an army. He did it just with pure Hulk rage and divine fire, if you will. Now, here's the twist. Samson had a weakness, or a kryptonite, if you will, because this guy sounds like Superman. And it wasn't his hair. It's because Samson wasn't just fighting the Philistines. He was also fighting himself and his own desires. So part of the vows was he cannot be with women from forbidden tribes. So, of course, like all good men, he kept chasing what he was commanded to resist, not just sexually, but spiritually. Every woman wasn't just lust. It was sort of a compromise of his mission. So Samson was strong, but he was also reckless. And he wasn't proactive. He was very reactive. He never reflected on his actions. He fought, slept, and he just trusted with no discernment, basically. And in the end, it wasn't his enemies who technically destroyed him, because he gave them the blade. So in comes the infiltration, Delilah. And Delilah wasn't just some, Middle Eastern temptress randomly walking in the desert. She was a paid agent. She was today's equivalent, what we would call a spy or a CIA operative. She was a tool of the Philistines' elite. And according to the story, each Philistine lord, there was 5 of them, offered her 1,100 pieces of silver. So that's totaling 5,500 silver coins. So to put some perspective on it, that's the equivalent of a prince's ransom. Those times in the Bronze Age, that was enough to buy you land, power, soldiers. I mean, you could even buy a war. So this wasn't seduction. This was a covert operation. This was state-sponsored espionage, if you will. So again, she wasn't some random woman Samson just stumbled upon, right? She was likely embedded. She was chosen. She was specifically positioned by these Philistine rulers. And her mission was clear, and it was only one thing: find the source of Samson's power and neutralize it. So, like any good seductress, she played the long game. The seduction wasn't rushed, and the affection wasn't real. And every kiss, every lie was specifically calculated. Now, Delilah, she was a weapon, but not of war. It was of whispers. Again, a state-sponsored seductress who weaponized intimacy. See, the Philistines couldn't beat Samson physically, so they didn't send warriors. They sent comfort, attention, softness. Sometimes empires fall not only to swords, but to pillows. Delilah, to me, is the original playbook for psychological warfare, psychops. It was how to disarm a man without raising a weapon. And her strategy was simple. She wanted to know the source of his power. So she asked him again and again and again. And each time, Samson, he gave her just a little bit more. That's not love. That is espionage. Now, to me, Delilah, or Samson and Delilah, also represent a toxic relationship. The very definition of a toxic relationship, the ancient version of this. And today we use terms such as gaslighting, manipulation, emotional warfare. Because Delilah wasn't just a woman. Again, she was a weapon. She was a mirror of something darker. And it was how intimacy becomes a strategy of war. The Philistines, again, they didn't send soldiers. They sent softness. They sent trust. They sent comfort. And that's the only way you break a man like Samson. And today, it still happens. Happens every day, just with new language. For example, we've all heard of the term gaslighting, this warping of reality. So for all of you who've been in abusive relationships or toxic relationships, you'll hear phrases like, "Why are you so sensitive?" Or "You're overreacting." I never said that. You must have misunderstood. Does that sound familiar? It does to me. Because gaslighting makes you question your memory, your instinct, your truth, what you know to be true. It's not just lying, it's reprogramming the way you see reality. And like many of you today, Samson, the strongest man ever, imagine that, lived that. Delilah asked him about his strength, not once, not twice, but again and again. And each time she tried to destroy him with the very answers that he gave her. And still, like many people today, he stayed, and he stayed in the relationship. That's how the strongest fall. Not through force, but through confusion. Another tactic, if you will. You hear this phrase a lot. Love bombing. What's love bombing? Excessive praise, constant affection, rapid attachment. They don't love you. They want to own you. And when you're addicted to the dopamine, they start with the withdrawals, hot and cold, they call it. So you'll hear phrases like, "You're different now," or "You don't love me the way you used to." I've heard that one a few times in my life. Control through attention, and then control through absence. Many of you experienced this before, right? You're constantly texting and then the texting stops. Hey, what happened? Right? So Delilah, back to my story, gave Samson softness, but only to get closer to his secret, the secret to his power, his strength. Now, she used another tactic that, again, is used till today: guilt trips and emotional leverage. So she told Samson such things as, "If you really love me, you tell me." That was her line. And today it's, "You're the reason I feel this way. I guess I just don't matter to you. Wow, you really don't care." That's not connection. That's not intimacy. That's warfare. Another similar tactic you could tie to this story is weaponizing vulnerability. You open up. You share things you're ashamed of, things about your past, your fears, your dreams, your aspirations. They nod, they smile, then later, they use it to cut you down. And then you hear things like, no wonder your ex left. Or, I love this one, you're just like your father. You'll never be enough. Samson gave Delilah his heart, he gave her the truth, and she gave it to his enemies. And it's still happening today, every day. Another tactic that she used is coercion, but coercion through intimacy, through sex. Because Delilah didn't hold a sword, she held his desire. And today, seduction has become a form of currency, promising affection and then withholding it, rewarding submission with closeness, and using sex not as connection, but as a leverage. And today, we have these new temples for seduction. We have social media, which is basically seduction culture. Because the modern Delilah doesn't need a palace. She's in your phone, in your algorithm, in your feed or your scroll. It's every thirst trap, every soft pose, and every single flex. And it's things like, I'm just showing you love. I'm just vibing. And it's not that. It's programming. It's a performance masked as authenticity, designed to trigger insecurity, envy, and hunger. And it works because most people never look past the surface of these things. And again, they won't tell you what to think. They'll just flood your feed with what you should desire. And that's not love, that's not connection, and that's definitely not honor, right? But validation, control, and a form of currency. This is a performance that's sold as empowerment, but it's still a script. It's written for applause and likes, and it's leverage. It's not just about individuals anymore. It's systemic. It's a culture of soft manipulation, and it's sold as personal branding. Because Delilah didn't kill Samson with a blade. She killed him with trust. And she used patience, softness, and time. Because again, the strongest men still fall. And it's not to war, it's not to swords, but it's to whispers. It's not in the battlefield, it's in the bedroom. And it's not with swords, it's with silence. So, again, now, eventually, Delilah found the source of Samson's power. And it was his vow. Part of his vow was not to put a razor to his head. And Samson disclosed the sacred vow he made to God. So the moment that Delilah cut his hair, it wasn't just a haircut. It was symbolically, if you will, a ritual of humiliation. A shorn hair equals public shame because the hair wasn't magic. Again, it was a symbol of a vow, of identity, of mission. And what it represents in the story, cutting it was like cutting his connection to God and exposing him just as a man. Of course, the Philistines blinded him. Philistines gouged out his eyes, and not just to weaken him, but to erase his identity as a warrior, a leader, a man. Because for a warrior, losing strength, that's one death. But losing sight, that's another level. That's a second death. Because there you have no vision, no direction, and no future. And now, they had him chained to a millstone. And at the time, this was a task meant only for donkeys and slaves. So imagine that the man who once tore lions and men apart was now walking in circles, blind and degraded. Because the Philistines didn't just defeat him, they made him a living symbol of their power. Now, blinding at the time, to give you some historical context, was common among ancient Near Eastern cultures. It was designed to basically break a prisoner's spirit. And the Philistines had a temple to a god, the temple of Dagon. That was a god of grain and fertility. And this was the stage for the ritual humiliation. So Samson to the Philistines was a threat to their gods and armies and way of life, and was now there just a blind fool for sport. Now, through all this humiliation and pain and suffering, this is the time of redemption. Samson, now stripped of everything, of strength, of sight, of dignity, in that moment, after losing his eyes, he could see everything, and he found clarity. His last prayer to the Lord God wasn't for forgiveness. It wasn't for peace. This was raw. And he said, let me die with them. Just give me my strength one more time. And he pulled the pillars, and the temple came down. He killed more people in death than in life, and not out of pride, but out of purpose. His final act wasn't victory, it was a sacrifice. Now, little side tangent here. They had archaeological digs and Philistine sites, places like Gaza and Ashdod. And they confirm that temples were often supported by two central loaded bearing columns. So his act isn't just a myth, it's actually maybe structurally possible. So Samson's story is not an accident. It's modern. It's yours and it's mine. And, men with potential, with strength, with divine purpose, imagine losing everything because they couldn't master impulse, lust, and vanity. Things that many men, including myself, have struggled with. And I believe women as well. Because nowadays, warriors don't just fall in war rooms anymore. They fall in the bedroom, in boardrooms, in the DMs, and in the mirror. Samson wasn't defeated by the Philistines. He was defeated by what he let inside, the enemy within. And strength without awareness is a trap, and power without purpose is a curse. And the fall always starts with a whisper that feels like love. The oldest wars are not fought with armies, they're fought in the heart. And I'll leave you guys with that. And like always, remember to lift more, eat more, rest more, love more, but love the right person, and hate less. Thank you guys.